and glossy brochures promised city visitors a perfect escape in nature. But within weeks of their completion, they were sinking, cracking, leaning, swallowed by mud and silence. It didn't happen slowly. It happened in a rush, as if the land had finally decided to push back. People in town whispered about greed, about arrogance, and about one man who had finally done what no one else had the courage to do. His name was Raymond Holt, a 62-year-old retired park ranger with calloused hands and eyes that carried decades of watching forests grow and rivers shift. And the woman whose dream was crumbling into the earth? Corinna Duval, the developer who promised prosperity but ignored every warning that stood in her way. The story of how these cabins came to ruin isn't just about business gone wrong. It's about heritage colliding with ambition, about a landowner who understood the lake better than anyone, and about a decision that changed everything in a single afternoon. Corinna first arrived in Jefferson County 2 years earlier with investors from Nashville and Chattanooga, driving a polished black SUV that looked almost alien against the 2-lane roads and weathered barns. She talked fast, moved fast, and smiled in a way that told you she was used to getting what she wanted. "This lake," she said during her first meeting at the community center, "is untapped potential. Families will come here, couples will come here, money will flow through this town like never before." The locals clapped politely, but their eyes drifted toward Raymond, who sat near the back with his arms crossed. The dam was his. The water was his family's responsibility, and every log and stone in that structure had been placed with patience. He stood up quietly and said, "You're talking about potential, Ms. Duval, but you don't know this water. You don't know what it takes to keep it steady." Corinna's smile never faltered. "With respect, Mr. Holt, progress can't be stopped. This is the future." That word, progress, hung in the air like a challenge. To Corinna, it meant cabins, profits, and headlines. To Raymond, it meant collapse, because he had watched too many developers treat the land as if it were an empty canvas. The truth was, the lake wasn't stable. Its edges were marshland, spongy and unpredictable. You could plant cattails there, maybe a fishing dock, but not rows of heavy cabins pressed shoulder to shoulder. Still, construction began. Bulldozers arrived, and the roar of machinery carried across the valley. Each week, new frames rose, identical and lifeless, their stilts sunk into ground that Raymond knew would never hold. He walked the shoreline, muttering to himself, remembering his father's words. "The lake gives, but it also takes." At night, he sat on his porch staring at the waterline. He knew the dam better than anyone, how much pressure it could bear, how much release it needed during the rainy season. Every warning he gave Corinna was brushed aside, every letter ignored, every phone call cut short. One evening, after his final attempt to reason with her, she said over the phone, "Mr. Holt, I respect your passion, but business is business. We'll manage the risk." He hung up without answering, because deep down, he knew what she didn't. You can't manage nature. You respect it, or it reminds you who is in charge. Weeks later, as the cabins neared completion, something shifted in Raymond. He wasn't a reckless man. He wasn't bitter for the sake of bitterness. But he was tired. Tired of warnings dismissed. Tired of seeing balance traded for greed. He began to imagine what would happen if the dam were opened. He didn't see destruction, he saw restoration. He saw the lake dropping back to its natural level, the marsh reclaiming its place, the birds returning to the mudflats where they had once nested. And so, as the town whispered and the cabins shone with their hollow newness, Raymond's choice began to form like a storm on the horizon. But before we reach the day the gates opened, you need to understand who Raymond was and why the lake meant more to him than money ever could. Raymond Holt was the kind of man you noticed not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with a quiet weight. At 62, his shoulders were broad but slightly bent from years of work, and his hands bore permanent marks from handling tools, ropes, and axes. Locals in Jefferson County often joked that he looked more like part of the landscape than a resident of it. He had spent nearly 40 years as a park ranger, most of them in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, patrolling trails, guiding lost hikers, and keeping an eye on the changing woods. For him, the job had never been about a paycheck. It was about stewardship, about watching over something older and greater than himself. When he retired, the land didn't let him go. He returned to his family's property near Cherokee Lake, where a modest stone dam, built by his grandfather in the late 1930s, still held back the waters. That dam wasn't grand by any means. No towering concrete wall, no massive turbines, just carefully stacked stone, steel reinforcements added in the 1970s, and a set of gates that required patient maintenance. But in Raymond's eyes, it was as important as any monument. It was the reason his family's farm had survived droughts, the reason fish stocked by the state had flourished, and the reason migratory birds had returned every spring. Neighbors often saw him out there at dawn, leaning on the railing, coffee mug steaming in the cool air, as he checked the water level against the old markers scratched into the rock. He could read the lake like other men read books. A dip in the reeds told him the water had dropped overnight. A cluster of herons at the inlet told him the fish were moving upstream. Every detail mattered. His wife, Lorna, used to tease him. "You talk about that lake like it's a person." And Raymond would shrug, answering, "That's because it is. It breathes, it shifts, it remembers." Lorna had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him in the small cabin they had shared. The silence weighed on him at first, but the lake gave him purpose. He mended nets, planted trees along the shore, and mentored local kids who wanted to learn about fishing and conservation. One boy, Travis Nguyen, followed him around like a shadow each summer. "Why do you care so much about mud and water?" Travis once asked. Raymond chuckled and said, "Because if you don't care, someone else will sell it off piece by piece." That belief put him directly in Corinna Duval's path. When she came with her plans, most of the townsfolk wavered. Jobs were scarce. Tourism money sounded tempting. A new development meant grocery stores and restaurants might thrive. But Raymond saw past the promises. He'd spent his life watching how quickly balance could be destroyed and how long it took to heal. One evening at the Rusty Lantern Diner, where farmers and teachers gathered after church, Corinna strolled in wearing a tailored blazer. She carried blueprints under her arm, setting them on the counter like a prize. The regulars leaned in, curious. Raymond stayed in his booth, arms crossed. "Mr. Holt," Corinna called out, her voice smooth but firm. "I was hoping to get your input." He raised an eyebrow. "My input hasn't mattered so far." A hush settled. Corinna forced a smile. "On the contrary, you're respected here. I'd like to hear your concerns." Raymond slid out of the booth, walked over, and tapped the edge of her papers. "You're putting too much weight on ground that won't hold. The lake can't carry it, and neither can the soil. You'll get your ribbon cutting, sure, but give it time. Nature always gets the last word." The diner stayed quiet. A few nodded at his words, others shifted uncomfortably, torn between opportunity and caution. Corinna gathered her papers, unfazed. "With all respect, Mr. Holt, I think you underestimate what careful planning can achieve." He stared at her for a moment, then said, "And I think you underestimate the land you're standing on." That exchange traveled fast. By the next morning, everyone in town was repeating it, some siding with Raymond's warning, others swept up by Corinna's promise of progress. But the divide only deepened, and Raymond knew the fight ahead wouldn't be about winning arguments. It would be about protecting what couldn't speak for itself. On quiet evenings, he sat by the dam, remembering his father's voice. "Hold the gates steady, son. Don't give the lake too much. Don't take too much from it. Balance is everything." Those words echoed louder now, as if warning him of the storm coming. But balance wasn't in Corinna's vocabulary, and the cabins were about to rise, no matter how many times Raymond spoke up. If Raymond was the anchor of tradition, Corinna Duval was the gust of wind that blew against it. She was 45, sharp-featured, always dressed like she had walked straight out of a boardroom in Nashville. Every hair in place, every word rehearsed, every gesture measured. To the folks in Jefferson County, she seemed like someone who belonged in a city council chamber, not a small-town diner. Her entrance into their lives wasn't subtle. She came with investors, glossy pamphlets, and a confidence that made people believe she could turn a quiet lake into the next big vacation hotspot. She had experience too, 3 successful developments behind her in Knoxville and Sevierville. Those were bigger markets, full of tourists who wanted cabins, lodges, and quick access to attractions. But Jefferson County wasn't like that. The lake here was smaller, quieter, and deeply tied to the families who had lived around it for generations. Corinna knew all of this, of course, but she believed in her vision more than in anyone else's history. At the community meeting where she first presented her plan, she spoke with her usual polished cadence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this lake has potential you've never tapped into. Imagine families spending weekends here. Imagine tax dollars strengthening your schools. Imagine small businesses thriving because of visitors who come to stay. We're talking about opportunity, real opportunity." A few people clapped, others whispered. And then Raymond rose to speak. "Miss Duval, you're not wrong about opportunity," he said, his voice steady. "But you're ignoring the cost. The lake is fragile. The ground is marsh. You build too close, it'll sink." Corinna flashed her smile, the kind that was practiced in the mirror. "Mr. Holt, I understand your concern, but engineering and design have come a long way. We've accounted for the soil, the water, and the long-term stability. You'll see. This will be something Jefferson County can be proud of." Her words carried authority, and people wanted to believe them. Jobs were scarce, and younger families were leaving the area in search of work. Some folks thought cabins might keep their kids around, might bring money to the town. Others, especially the older generation, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. After the meeting, Corinna approached Raymond directly. "You've got quite the influence here," she said softly, standing close so others couldn't overhear. "You could make this easier for everyone if you'd support the project instead of resisting it." Raymond didn't flinch. Easier isn't the same as right. That exchange set the tone for everything that followed. Construction started the next spring. Bulldozers flattened the shoreline, tearing out cattails and willows. Trucks rolled in day and night, carrying lumber and concrete. The sound of hammering carried across the water, replacing the calls of herons and the splash of fish. Corinna oversaw it all, clipboard in hand, heels digging into soft earth that she insisted would hold once everything was finished. She wasn't cruel, but she was dismissive. To her, Raymond was an obstacle, a stubborn man clinging to the past. When he came to her office trailer one afternoon, boots muddy from walking the dam, she barely looked up from her paperwork. "You're pushing this lake past its limit," he told her. "We're creating something beautiful," she replied. "You're creating collapse," Corinna sighed, set down her pen, and fixed him with a steady look. "Mr. Holt, I know you think you're protecting something sacred, but this is business. People want cabins, people pay for cabins, and I'm here to deliver. The land will adjust." Raymond shook his head slowly. "Land doesn't adjust. It breaks." Their conversations always ended this way, with her insisting on control and him warning of consequences. But while she brushed him off, Corinna wasn't completely blind. She knew the soil reports had raised some red flags. She knew a few engineers had advised against building so close to the waterline. But those voices were easier to silence when investors were hungry and when contracts had already been signed. She had promised profit, and profit required speed. As the cabins rose, one after another, identical frames lined like soldiers, townsfolk gathered at the diner, the gas station, the church parking lot, debating what it all meant. Some were hopeful, others were worried. Everyone watched the silent battle between Raymond and Corinna, wondering who would be proven right. And while Corinna smiled at ribbon cuttings and posed for photos with county officials, Raymond kept pacing the dam, waiting for the day nature would make its judgment. But before judgment came, the fight spread to the people themselves, dividing neighbors, friends, even families over whether Corinna's dream was salvation or disaster. But while Raymond saw collapse on the horizon, the community itself was tearing apart, divided between hope for prosperity and fear of losing everything they had left. By the time spring rolled into summer, the lake no longer sounded like it used to. The mornings weren't quiet, with only birdsong and the rustle of reeds. Instead, the grind of machinery echoed across the valley. Locals joked that you could tell the time of day not by the sun, but by when the bulldozers started up. Corinna Duval had moved fast. Permits were approved in record time, thanks in part to her polished presentations at county meetings and the promises of increased tax revenue. She had an answer for every objection. Concerns about soil stability? She cited engineers. Questions about wildlife? She referenced environmental studies, though few in town ever saw the paperwork. Jobs and growth, she argued, outweighed hesitation. Within months, lumber was stacked like a fortress along the shore. Crews worked in shifts, hammering frames, pouring concrete for stilts, laying the foundations of what would become 139 cabins. Each one identical, each one crowding closer to the water's edge than the last. To visitors passing through, it might have looked like progress. To Raymond, it looked like a slow-motion disaster. He tried to speak reason wherever he could. At the gas station, he cornered his neighbor, Earl Mathis, who had signed on to haul gravel for the project. "Earl, you know that shoreline won't hold. You've fished there same as me. You've seen how soft it gets after a good rain." Earl shifted uncomfortably, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ray, I hear you. I do. But I got bills. Corinna's paying good money, and work like this don't come around here often." Raymond sighed. "Short money now, long loss later. You know it." Earl looked down, then muttered, "Maybe. But I don't got the luxury to think long." That was the tension in Jefferson County. Families needed jobs, but they also knew Raymond wasn't speaking nonsense. Everyone had walked those marshy edges, felt their boots sink into the mud. Everyone knew the dam wasn't a permanent guarantee. Still, Corinna's vision blinded many. At a Sunday gathering outside the First Baptist Church, the subject came up again. Townsfolk leaned against pickup trucks, children chasing each other across the grass while adults argued. "You're too stuck in the past, Ray," said Linda Joe, the local grocer. "This place has been drying up for years. People don't stop here unless they're lost. Maybe cabins will keep the town alive." Raymond looked at her, calm but firm. "The town ain't alive if the land's gone. What's money worth if you've poisoned what feeds you?" A younger man, Jeff McCormick, jumped in. "Money feeds us too, Ray. Jobs mean I can keep my kids in school clothes. Not everyone's got a pension to lean on." The group quieted. Raymond didn't argue further. He just repeated what he had been saying all along. "The land breaks, the cabins sink. Then where's your jobs?" But for every conversation he had, Corinna had 3 more, always smooth, always optimistic. She hosted luncheons at the diner, inviting potential investors and promising locals discount rates if they booked cabins for family reunions or holidays. She smiled for the county newspaper, standing in front of the rising frames, hard hat perched on her hair like a prop. Raymond's frustration grew, not because people disagreed with him, but because they refused to see what was already happening. The waterline had dipped unusually low in May, forcing him to adjust the dam earlier than normal. Fish floated belly up near the shore where construction runoff had poured in. A pair of herons that had returned each spring didn't show that year. To Raymond, these weren't accidents. They were warnings. He even brought his concerns to the county commission. Standing before the board, his voice carried years of authority. "You're putting 139 cabins where wetlands should be. You've ignored soil studies, ignored warnings. If you don't stop this, nature will stop it for you." The chairperson, uncomfortable under his steady gaze, shuffled papers. "Mr. Holt, we appreciate your perspective, but Ms. Duval has provided all necessary documentation. We trust the professionals she's hired." Raymond laughed bitterly. "Professionals paid to tell her what she wants to hear." Corinna, seated at the front, crossed her legs and gave him a small, knowing smile. By late summer, the cabins were nearly finished. Their wooden decks jutted out over the water, some so close that rainstorms splashed directly against the pilings. Tourists driving by slowed their cars to stare at the sight, rows upon rows of fresh timber, glossy paint, and identical windows reflecting the lake. Raymond stood on the dam one evening, watching the sun fall behind the construction. He thought of his father's words about balance, about not giving the lake too much. But here it was, too much all at once, and no one listening. By the time the cabins reached their final coats of paint, Jefferson County was no longer just building along the lake. It was building fault lines between its own people. Folks who once waved to each other at stop signs now crossed the street rather than talk. A single question seemed to hang over the town like storm clouds. Was Corinna's project salvation, or was it ruin? At the Rusty Lantern Diner, the air was thick with the argument almost every night. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, retirees, all had an opinion. One evening, Raymond slid into his usual corner booth, ordering only black coffee. The place was busier than usual, and all anyone wanted to talk about was the new cabins. Across the room, Jeff McCormick raised his voice, tired of keeping it bottled in. "Look, y'all can complain all you want, but my cousin's working construction over there and making more than he's ever earned. Tell me how that's bad for this town." A woman near the counter snapped back. "Because when the lake goes, Jeff, so does your cousin's job." "Then what?" Jeff shook his head. "Always the same argument, always doomsday. Maybe, just maybe, this time things work out." All eyes turned to Raymond. He didn't ask for it, but his silence carried weight. After a long sip of coffee, he finally spoke. "The lake won't hold. You're betting your future on mud." The diner quieted for a moment. Then Corinna herself walked in, heels clicking against the floor. She'd made it a habit to stop by, smiling, shaking hands, keeping herself visible. Tonight was no different. She walked straight over to Raymond's booth. "Mr. Holt," she said brightly, though her eyes were sharp. "You'll have to forgive the noise out there. Progress isn't always gentle." He looked up at her slowly. "Noise ain't the problem, Ms. Duval. Balance is. You're tipping the scale, and when it falls, don't say you weren't warned." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Corinna smiled tightly. "Balance," she repeated. "That's a word I respect, which is why my team has taken every precaution. These cabins will stand longer than you think." Some clapped at her words, others exchanged skeptical looks. Raymond only leaned back in his seat, unconvinced. But the tension didn't stay confined to diners or county meetings. It seeped into homes. Families who'd lived side by side for generations now sat on opposite sides of the argument. Take the Harts, for example. Frank Hart was a retired schoolteacher, always pragmatic. His wife, June, ran the local quilting circle. For decades, they'd been the kind of couple who volunteered at bake sales and organized food drives. But when it came to the cabins, they couldn't agree. One night in their kitchen, June slammed a dish towel on the counter. "Frank, I don't understand how you can't see what's happening. You've fished those waters since you were a boy. You know how soft that ground is." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "And I also know our grandson needs work. He's out there with the crew now, earning honest money. You want me to tell him to quit because maybe the cabins sink someday?" June's voice broke. "It's not someday, it's soon. And when it happens, what will you tell him then?" That kind of argument played out all across the county. Hope against fear, profit against preservation. Even church sermons couldn't avoid it. Pastor Clay at First Baptist tried one Sunday. "The good book says the wise man builds his house upon rock. What happens when you build upon sand?" The congregation exchanged glances, everyone catching the reference. Meanwhile, Raymond carried himself the same as always, steady, deliberate, but quieter now. He'd already spoken his piece more times than he could count. The cabins kept rising anyway, yet the unease in the community only made his warnings sharper in people's minds. Some called him stubborn, others called him prophetic. By September, the first brochures for lakeshore cabins at Cherokee were circulating. Glossy pictures showed smiling families grilling on the decks, kayaks gliding across still water, children fishing off the docks. The photos looked like paradise. Locals knew better. The cabins in the pictures hadn't been there a year. They hadn't faced a single hard winter or spring flood. But the investors didn't care. Reservations were already being booked. At the post office, neighbors stood in line, clutching bills and catalogs, talking in low voices about the pictures. One man muttered, "Looks like they built Disney World out there." Another answered, "Looks like they built it on quicksand." Raymond, standing behind them, didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. They already knew where he stood. But the strain wasn't just on the community anymore, it was on the lake itself, and signs of collapse were beginning to show in ways no one could ignore. It was only one cabin, but it was enough to confirm what Raymond had been saying for months. But for Raymond, one cabin collapsing wasn't the disaster, it was the warning. And he knew the only way to save the lake was a decision no one else would dare to make. By late September, the lake was beginning to look sick. To someone passing through, it might have seemed the same. Calm, blue, framed by cabins gleaming in the sun. But those who lived nearby knew something was off. The waterline dipped lower than usual. Algae spread faster along the shore. Dead fish appeared in clusters, their silver bodies floating near the boat ramps. Raymond noticed every sign. He had spent a lifetime reading water, and nothing about what he was seeing felt normal. One evening, he brought his old pickup to the far edge of the cabins where the crews had just finished laying sod. A few workers were still there, tossing cigarette butts in the dirt as they loaded tools into their truck. Raymond stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the shoreline. The mud was cracking, breaking apart in wide veins that stretched toward the cabin's stilts. "Mr. Holt," one of the workers called, smirking. "You here to give us another warning?" Raymond ignored the sarcasm. He bent down, scooped a handful of mud, and squeezed. Water oozed between his fingers, then the soil collapsed into sludge. "Tell your boss this ground won't last a season," he said evenly. The worker laughed, shaking his head. "That's above my pay grade." But Raymond wasn't laughing. He left the site and drove straight to Corinna's office trailer. She was inside, going over contracts with 2 investors, both dressed in city suits. The moment she saw him, she sighed. "Mr. Holt, I can't imagine what brings you here this late." Raymond stepped inside, boots still muddy. "You're killing the lake. The fish are already dying. The water's dropping faster than I've ever seen. If you don't stop now, it won't just be cabins falling. It'll be lawsuits and lives ruined." One of the investors frowned, shifting in his chair. "Is that true?" Corinna's jaw tightened, but her smile remained. "With respect, Mr. Holt exaggerates. He's always been opposed to this project. Nature shifts, yes, but our structures are built to adapt." Raymond's voice rose for the first time. "You can't adapt against nature. You don't control it. You respect it." The room fell silent. Even the investors looked unsettled. Corinna, however, didn't flinch. She gathered her papers, stood, and said, "Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Mr. Holt has strong feelings, but feelings don't build communities. Progress does. I'll see you both tomorrow." The investors left without a word, and Corinna turned on Raymond the moment the door closed. "Do you realize what you just did? You embarrassed me in front of men who've poured money into this project." Raymond stared at her, his voice low and steady again. "No, Corinna, you embarrassed yourself by building where you shouldn't, and the lake is already proving me right." For the first time, her smile cracked. Just slightly. Then she straightened her blazer, brushing off her sleeves. "If you think I'll let one stubborn man ruin what I've built, you're mistaken. Get out." He left without another word. But something inside him shifted that night. He had spent months warning her, warning the community, warning anyone who would listen. No one cared enough to stop it. Now the lake was giving signs of collapse, and he knew what would come next. 2 days later, rain poured across the county. A heavy autumn storm that lasted nearly 20 hours. Raymond stood at the dam in his raincoat, water slamming against the gates, mud churning along the shoreline. By dawn, several cabin decks were already tilting, their stilts sinking into the softened ground. One of the property managers called Corinna in a panic, saying, "We've got water pooling under 6 cabins. The ground's turning to soup." Corinna drove out immediately, splashing mud across her tires, investors calling her phone non-stop. When she arrived, workers were shoving sandbags under the foundations, their boots sinking ankle-deep with every step. She barked orders, tried to stay composed, but the fear in her eyes was clear. Raymond was there too, standing at a distance, arms folded. Corinna spotted him and stormed over. "Are you enjoying this? Watching us struggle?" He shook his head. "No. I warned you. I begged you to listen. Now the lake's showing you what happens when you push too far." She clenched her fists. "This is just a setback. We'll reinforce. We'll stabilize." Raymond's gaze hardened. "You can't reinforce against greed. You can't stabilize against arrogance. The ground doesn't care about your profits." Their argument was cut short by a crack. Loud, sharp, unmistakable. Everyone turned as one of the cabins shifted violently, its stilts snapping under the weight. The structure sagged, half of it plunging into the mud with a groan of splintering wood. Workers shouted, pulling back. Corinna froze, her mouth open. The night after the storm, Raymond couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain still echoed in his ears, even though the skies had cleared. He sat at his kitchen table with a lamp burning low, staring at a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. Outside, the frogs had returned to the shallow pools along the marsh, croaking as if nothing unusual had happened. But Raymond knew better. He kept seeing that cabin collapse in his mind, timbers snapping, mud swallowing the stilts. To Corinna, it was just one unlucky unit. To him, it was proof that the balance had already tipped. The lake wasn't holding anymore, and if the cabins stayed, if the pressure on the shoreline continued, the collapse wouldn't stop at one. He reached into an old cigar box on the counter, pulling out a stack of photographs. His father, standing at the dam in the 1960s, hand on the steel crank. His grandfather, shirtless, knee-deep in the water, placing the stones that would form the base wall. In every picture, the message was the same. The dam wasn't just a structure, it was responsibility. His family hadn't built it to make money. They built it to keep the land alive. The memories pulled him deeper. He could still hear his father's voice, gravelly with age. Don't give the lake too much. Don't take too much from it. Keep it steady. Balance is everything. That voice followed him the next morning as he walked into town. He stopped at the Rusty Lantern, where only a few locals sat drinking coffee. Travis and Gwyn, now 19 and working part-time at the hardware store, was behind the counter. He looked up, grinning. "Morning, Ray. You hear about the cabin that sank? Guess you were right all along." Raymond didn't smile. "Being right doesn't feel good when the land's breaking, Travis." Travis poured him a coffee and leaned close. "So what now? You gonna take him to court?" Raymond shook his head. "Courts don't move fast enough. Nature doesn't wait for hearings." Travis frowned, unsure what Raymond meant, but Raymond left without explaining. That afternoon, he visited his neighbor, Earl Mathis. Earl was stacking firewood, sweat darkening his shirt. Raymond leaned against the fence. "Earl, you saw it. The cabins are already sinking." Earl wiped his brow. "Yeah, hard to watch. But Corinna says they're reinforcing. She's got crews pouring concrete under the worst spots." "That's like patching a sinking boat with duct tape," Raymond replied. Earl hesitated. "Ray, what are you thinking?" Raymond looked him in the eye. "I'm thinking about balance, and about how my family built that dam for the land, not for someone else's profit." Earl's face fell. "Ray, you wouldn't." Raymond didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving Earl with a knot in his stomach. That evening, Raymond returned to the dam. The sun dipped low, painting the water orange. He stood at the gate, his hands resting on the iron crank. He knew what it meant to turn it. He knew the lawsuits, the accusations, the headlines. People would call him reckless, destructive, maybe even criminal. But when he looked at the marsh beyond the cabins, the reeds gasping for space, the birds that hadn't returned, he felt clarity instead of doubt. He whispered out loud as if speaking to his father. "If I keep it closed, the lake dies. If I open it, the land lives." The weight of that choice pressed on him. He pictured Corinna's face, smug in her office trailer, dismissing his warnings. He pictured the townsfolk torn between jobs and heritage. And then he pictured the lake as it used to be, before cabins, before investors, before anyone thought money mattered more than balance. As darkness fell, Raymond sat on the dam's railing, still undecided. He didn't take action that night, but the choice had settled inside him like a seed, waiting. The next day, Corinna held another press event near the cabins. Reporters from Knoxville had come to cover the challenges of the development. Standing before microphones, Corinna spoke with her usual poise. "Setbacks are part of any project. We're addressing the issues head-on. These cabins are here to stay." Raymond watched from the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight. When Corinna finished, he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "The land will decide if they stay." The reporters turned, cameras flashing. Corinna glared, but she didn't answer. She couldn't, not in front of the press. That night, Raymond returned to the dam again. The moon was high, casting silver across the water. He placed his hands on the crank and closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather, his father, his late wife, and every warning he had ever given. The decision no longer felt like a choice, it felt like duty. But before he pulled that lever, before the lake drained, the final storm of confrontation with Corinna was yet to come. The confrontation came sooner than Raymond expected. Word had gotten around that he'd been seen spending more and more time at the dam, standing there long after dark, as if waiting for something. Corinna heard the rumors and drove out herself one afternoon, her black SUV crunching along the gravel road that led to the water's edge. Raymond was there, of course. He always was, leaning against the railing with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the lake. The surface was calm, almost too calm, reflecting the cabins like a mirror. Corinna stepped out, heels sinking slightly into the gravel. "Mr. Holt," she called. Her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Raymond didn't turn. "Talking's all we've done, Ms. Duval. Talking while you build and the land sinks." She walked closer, folding her arms. "You've been spreading rumors. People are saying you plan to sabotage this project. I won't have it." Finally, he faced her. His eyes were steady, his voice low. "Not sabotage. Correction." Corinna stiffened. "Do you realize what you're saying? If you touch that dam, you'll destroy millions of dollars in investment. You'll destroy jobs, futures. This entire county could collapse economically." Raymond's expression didn't change. "You already destroyed the lake. Futures built on mud don't last." For a moment, their words hung in the air. The only sound was the creak of the dam and the faint slap of water against the stones. Then Corinna stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you do this, you won't just be the stubborn old ranger. You'll be a criminal. You'll go to jail." Raymond leaned in slightly, his words sharp. "Then let them jail me. I'd rather sit in a cell knowing the lake will breathe again than sit on my porch watching you kill it piece by piece." They locked eyes. Corinna's composure faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. She turned on her heel, storming back to her SUV. The tires spit gravel as she drove away. Raymond stood there long after she left, the weight of his decision pressing heavier than ever. He could hear his father's voice again, echoing from memory. "Balance, Ray. Don't give too much. Don't take too much." By nightfall, the valley was silent. The cabins stood dark, only a few lanterns glowing from the work crew's trailers. Raymond walked slowly toward the crank, lantern in hand. His boots scraped against the old concrete. He placed the lantern on the railing and gripped the iron wheel with both hands. It resisted at first. The metal hadn't been turned that far in years. His muscles strained, his breath came heavy. But inch by inch, the gate began to move. The first groan of rushing water echoed under his feet, low and rumbling like the awakening of something ancient. Then it came, a surge of release as the lake began to drain. The current rushed through the opened gate, pulling weeds, branches, and mud with it. The surface rippled wildly, no longer a mirror, but a restless churn. Raymond kept turning, sweat rolling down his temples. The sound grew louder, water pouring through the dam in torrents, echoing down the valley. He stopped only when the gate was fully open, the lake now surrendering itself to gravity. He stepped back, lantern flickering, and watched as the shoreline pulled away from the cabins. Within hours, the water level dropped several feet. Decks that had once skimmed the surface now hung above patches of mud. By morning, the marshland had begun to reappear, sucking at the pilings. One by one, the cabins tilted, their supports cracking under the shifting earth. At sunrise, workers arrived in shock. Shouts rang out across the site. "The lake's gone," one cried. Another stumbled through ankle-deep muck, cursing as his boots stuck. Phones lit up as calls were made, voices panicked. Corinna arrived within an hour, eyes blazing, her SUV skidding to a stop. She stormed toward Raymond, who stood calmly on the dam, watching. "What did you do?" she screamed, her voice breaking. He didn't flinch. "I gave it back." Cabin after cabin groaned and sagged, wood splintering as mud claimed what had been forced upon it. To the investors, it was ruin. To Raymond, it was restoration. The lake was returning to what it had always been, free from the weight of concrete and profit. Corinna stared in disbelief, her face pale. Around her, workers argued, some angry, some awed. The town would soon be divided even further between those who saw Raymond as a criminal and those who saw him as the only man brave enough to put things right. But as the cabins fell, the true collapse wasn't just in wood and mud. It was in trust, in livelihoods, and in the fragile ties holding the community together. By the end of that week, Jefferson County was a storm without rain. Everyone was talking, at church, in the aisles of the grocery store, on porches late into the night. Word of the drained lake and the collapsing cabins traveled fast, and by the time local papers picked it up, reporters from Knoxville and even as far as Atlanta were already rolling into town with cameras. The front page of the Jefferson Chronicle carried the headline, "Developer's Dream Sinks as Lake Drains Overnight." Beneath it was a grainy photo of half-submerged cabins, their stilts twisted, roofs leaning like crooked teeth. The county sheriff's office had no choice but to get involved. Sheriff Paul Reeves, a man who had known Raymond since high school, drove out to the dam in person. He found Raymond leaning against his truck, as if waiting. "Ray," the sheriff said quietly, "tell me straight. Did you open those gates?" Raymond didn't hesitate. "Yes." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat. "You know what this means, don't you?" "I know what it means for the lake," Raymond replied. "The rest, we'll see." The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "Corinna's already filed charges, sabotage, property damage. She's demanding we haul you in." Raymond looked toward the waterline, now lower, healthier, with reeds already sprouting where mud had surfaced. "Do what you have to do, Paul." "I did what I had to do." The sheriff hesitated, torn between duty and loyalty. He finally muttered, "Get in the truck." By the time Raymond arrived at the county jail, reporters had gathered outside, cameras flashing. Microphones were shoved at him as he walked past. "Mr. Holt, do you admit to destroying the cabins?" one asked. Another shouted, "Are you a hero or a criminal?" Raymond said nothing. His silence only deepened the divide. Inside the town, battle lines hardened. Some people, especially those who had invested their savings or taken jobs with the project, were furious. At the Rusty Lantern Diner, Jeff McCormick slammed his fist on the table. "He stole food from my kids' mouths. Those cabins were going to put money in this town for years." Others, however, felt something different. Relief. June Hart, the retired teacher's wife, who had argued with her husband about the cabins, stood up in the diner and said firmly, "Raymond saved us. You think jobs matter if the land is poisoned? Look at that lake now. It's breathing again." Arguments turned into shouting matches. Friendships frayed. The project had already divided the county. Raymond's decision made the fracture permanent. Meanwhile, Corinna faced her own reckoning. The investors who once stood proudly at her side now flooded her phone with angry calls. One meeting in Knoxville turned ugly when a lawyer for one of the largest backers slammed a binder on the table. "You promised stability. You promised us return on investment, and you let some old man drain the very thing you built around? You'll be lucky if bankruptcy's the worst of it." Corinna tried to fight back, insisting the county should hold Raymond solely responsible. But in quieter moments, she couldn't avoid the truth. She had been warned. Repeatedly. Her arrogance had pushed the project past the point of no return. Back in Jefferson County, Raymond was released on bail after just 2 nights. The sheriff had spoken to the judge, arguing he wasn't a flight risk. When Raymond walked out, dozens of locals were waiting. Half of them clapped, the other half jeered. Some shook his hand, others spat near his boots. One boy, Travis, rushed forward. "Ray, you did it. The marsh is back already. I saw frogs where I haven't seen them in years." Raymond smiled faintly, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's what matters." But even as he spoke, he knew the storm was far from over. Lawsuits loomed. The county commission scheduled an emergency meeting, and Corinna was already making television appearances, painting him as reckless, dangerous, even unhinged. On the evening news, she appeared in a crisp blazer, saying, "This wasn't restoration. This was destruction. One man cannot be allowed to hold an entire community hostage because he clings to outdated notions of ownership. We will seek justice." Raymond watched from his porch, sipping coffee. He shook his head slowly. To him, her words didn't matter anymore. The lake behind her told the real story. Water low, yes, but life already returning. The town, though, wasn't sure what story to believe. Some saw Raymond as a guardian. Others saw him as a villain. And in that uncertainty, the tension only deepened. But beneath all the arguments and lawsuits, a quieter question began to rise. Was this collapse really about one man's choice, or about a community blinded by promises it should never have trusted? The cabins never stood a chance. By winter, most of them had collapsed into the marsh, their frames twisted, decks buried in silt. A few remained upright, but empty. No renters, no tourists, just hollow shells staring out at a lake that no longer wanted them. The brochures promising paradise had stopped circulating. The website advertising lakeshore cabins at Cherokee went dark. What had once been marketed as the county's future was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Corinna Duval spent those months in courtrooms and conference calls. The lawsuits came from every direction: investors, contractors, even the county itself. Each one drained her resources further. The woman who had once walked into Jefferson County with polished confidence was now described in the papers with harsher words: reckless, arrogant, careless. In private, she fought to salvage her reputation, but her empire had cracked just as fast as the cabins had. Raymond Holt, meanwhile, returned to his routine. Every morning he checked the dam, his boots crunching over frost as he leaned against the railing. The lake was lower than before, yes, but healthier. Reeds grew where cabins had once stood. Ducks returned in flocks, the kind he hadn't seen in years. Fishermen began talking about the bass biting again, stronger, hungrier. Slowly, the land was reclaiming itself. Not everyone forgave him. Some neighbors refused to speak when he passed them on Main Street. At the hardware store, he overheard men muttering, "That old fool ruined everything." But just as many people thanked him quietly. Farmers who noticed their wells clearer, bird watchers who spotted herons back in the marsh, parents who told their children the story of the man who stood up for the lake. One evening, Travis came by with a notebook in hand. "Mr. Holt," he said shyly, "I've got to write an essay for school about someone I admire. I want to write about you." Raymond chuckled, shaking his head. "Son, I'm no hero. I just did what needed doing." "But everyone else was scared to," Travis insisted. "You weren't." That night, Raymond sat by the fire, thinking about the boy's words. Maybe he wasn't a hero. Maybe he was just a stubborn old man who couldn't stand to see his family's work undone. But when he listened to the chorus of frogs outside, when he watched the water ripple naturally again, he felt peace. The town itself eventually adjusted. Some families moved away, chasing jobs elsewhere. Others stayed, finding new pride in the lake as it healed. Arguments still flared at the diner now and then, but they didn't last as long. People were tired of fighting, tired of choosing sides. The cabins became a landmark, a reminder. Nature doesn't bend just because someone waves money at it. In his final interview with a local paper, Raymond said it plainly. "What happened here wasn't about me and Corinna. It was about the land teaching us a lesson we should have already known. You can't build forever without respecting what holds you up. You can't take and expect balance to stay." The reporter asked him if he regretted it. Opening the dam, draining the lake, facing lawsuits and scorn. Raymond looked out at the waterline before answering. "Regret? No. My father used to say the lake isn't ours to keep, only ours to care for. I cared for it the only way I knew how." Those words spread further than he expected. Not just in Jefferson County, but in neighboring towns, then across the state. Some called him reckless still, but others began to use his name alongside words like protector and steward. To him, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the lake was alive. The cabins sank. The brochures rotted. The lawsuits dragged on, but the water? The water kept moving, steady and sure, just as it always had when his grandfather first laid the stones. And maybe that was the truest lesson of all, that nature always gets the final word. So when you think about your own choices, big or small, remember this story. Remember Raymond, standing at that dam, choosing to act when no one else would. Ask yourself, are you chasing profit, or are you protecting balance? Because one lasts a season, the other lasts a lifetime. If you believe in stories that remind us of respect, for land, for legacy, for doing what's right even when it costs, then make sure to subscribe. More stories are waiting, and each one carries a lesson worth holding on to.